Okay, let's dive into this. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating, albeit kind of dark chapter in human history. We're going to explore how society over centuries meticulously constructed what we can metaphorically call the Citadel. You know, this wasn't just some physical fortress made of bricks and mortar, it was an entire architecture of exclusion. It was a system designed specifically to silence the margins of society and literally lock away anything it deemed as unreason.
And to really get into the weeds of this, we're drawing entirely from our sole primary text for this explainer, Michel Foucault's groundbreaking work, Madness and Civilization. Now, Foucault doesn't just give us a dry, boring history of psychiatry here. He meticulously maps out the historical metamorphosis of madness itself. He shows us, pretty convincingly, how the very definition of insanity shifted entirely depending on what society needed to exclude at any given time.
So here's our blueprint for deconstructing this historical citadel. First, we'll look at the void of the sacred leper. Second, fluid margins and fools. Third, confinement and labor script. Fourth, the monologue of reason. And finally, we'll wrap up with the magician's medical gaze.
Just to get our bearings before we start, here's the exact chronological path we'll be taking. Notice the massive sweep of time we're covering across European history. We're going from the disappearance of leprosy, way back in the 1400s, right through to the literary ships of fools, into the brutal confinement eras of the 1600s, and finally landing on the supposed liberation of the insane at the end of the 18th century. Let's start right at the beginning.
All right, Section 1, Void of the Sacred Leper. Let's look at the pre-Citadel era, specifically the literal and metaphorical spaces left behind at the close of the Middle Ages.
So, think back to the Middle Ages. Back then, the absolute ultimate outcast was the leper. But their exclusion was actually highly specific. Yes, they were physically removed from the community and put into Lazarus houses on the very edges of cities, yet paradoxically, they were totally spiritually integrated. Their exclusion offered this strange form of communion, a kind of sacred distance, if you will. People viewed them as a physical manifestation of God's anger, sure, but also His grace. The idea was that by suffering so visibly on earth, their salvation in heaven was practically guaranteed. They still belonged to a grand cosmic order.
But then, between the 1200s and 1400s, something huge happened. Leprosy largely vanished from Europe. Suddenly, thousands of these Lazar houses were just sitting there, totally empty. And this brilliantly illustrates Foucault's core argument. As leprosy vanished, it left a massive structural void. The physical buildings were empty, yeah, but more importantly, the spiritual and moral space of the ultimate scapegoat was empty. Society still had this deeply ingrained psychological need to exclude something. So as Foucault outlines, it was the madman who eventually inherited the sterile wasteland, slowly transitioning into society's new archetype of the sacred leper.
Moving to Section 2, Fluid Margins and Fools. Before the madman was permanently locked away behind stone walls, there was a really fascinating transitional period during the Renaissance.
During the Renaissance, imagination, and honestly sometimes in actual historical reality, the madman was placed on a boat. This was the famous Stultifera Navis, or the Ship of Fools. At this specific time, madness was intimately associated with water. Think about it, water is fluid, it's a constant passage, it's totally liminal. The madman out on a boat becomes the passenger par excellence, bound completely to the purifying uncertainty of fate. In this era, the archetypes of the margins reflected madness not as some clinical illness, but as a mysterious cosmic truth. It represented a dark, hidden knowledge about the unreason of the world, kept constantly moving on the water long before the rigid stone walls of the Citadel were ever built.
Which brings us to a really pivotal question for this explainer. How exactly did we get from that open, spiritual horizon of the Renaissance, where the madman essentially held a mirror up to society's own foolishness, into the incredibly rigid, punitive lockdown of the classical age? What actually caused the Citadel to be built?
That takes us to Section 3, Confinement and Labor Script. The crucial point here is a massive historical pivot in the 17th century, a period Foucault famously calls the Great Confinement.
Okay, so in 1656, Paris founded the Hôpital Général. But here is the massive misconception Foucault completely shatters for us. This was not a medical establishment. Not at all. It was actually a semi-judicial structure. See, the 17th century was going through a severe economic crisis, and in response, this new bourgeois moral imperative popped up, which we can call the master script of labor. All of a sudden, idleness wasn't just considered laziness anymore, it was literally viewed as the ultimate rebellion against God. The Citadel was built not to cure sick people, but to fiercely condemn idleness and enforce labor.
Just look at who was actually housed in this 17th century citadel. You had the poor, the unemployed, vagabonds, hardened criminals, and the mad. They were all just locked up together. Crazy, right? But why? Because under that rigid master script of labor, they had all committed the exact same sin: social uselessness. They didn't produce. This is a massive structural shift. The madman is no longer a cosmic passenger on the water holding secret knowledge. Instead, madness has been completely redefined as a social and moral failure.
Section 4. The monologue of reason. Now, locking people up physically obviously has profound psychological and linguistic consequences. This brings us to a concept we can call the Gutenberg glitch, which is the absolute silencing of the madman's voice.
Foucault argues strongly that the classical age entirely severed the dialogue between reason and madness. The physical internment of the mad behind the thick walls of the Citadel totally paralleled a tragic linguistic silencing. Before confinement, the madman spoke in a kind of linguistic alchemy. Sure, it was poetic, strange, maybe even unreadable at times, but it was absolutely still considered part of the shared human dialogue. But once they were confined, all those stammered, imperfect words were thrust into oblivion. Reason just stopped listening. The glitch was complete, the signal was reduced to mere noise by the guardians of the Citadel.
And this leads us to what I think is one of Foucault's most powerful insights. The entire language of modern psychiatry, which starts developing out of this era, is not a dialogue with the mad. It is literally a monologue of reason about madness. The same person observes the mad person, categorizes them, and then speaks for them. The exchange is completely dead. Reason speaks, and madness is forced to just listen in silence.
Section 5. The magician's medical gaze. This dynamic of observation sets up the final and maybe most surprising twist in our historical metamorphosis: the birth of the modern asylum at the end of the 18th century, led by figures like Samuel Tuke and Philippe Pinel.
Now, history books love to celebrate Tuke and Pinel as absolute heroes because they literally struck the iron chains off the mad in these asylums. But Foucault drops a bombshell here. He argues they didn't really free anyone. They simply replaced physical chains with moral ones. Instead of external punishment and iron shackles, the modern asylum used guilt, the stifling anguish of responsibility and relentless internal observation. The constraint didn't magically disappear, it just moved inside the patient's own mind.
And overseeing this terrifying new internalized prison is the doctor, a figure we can call the magician, who wields this intense medical gaze. The doctor suddenly becomes the ultimate institutional arbiter of truth. By observing the patient, judging them constantly, and making them feel responsible for their own delirium, the magician permanently stripped the madman of their narrative sovereignty. The patient is no longer the author of their own experience. They literally have to blindly accept the doctor's rational, clinical explanation of their illness.
As Foucault chillingly puts it, the modern asylum substituted for the free terror of madness the stifling anguish of responsibility. The medical gaze installed the Citadel directly into the minds of the marginalized. They were forced to constantly look at themselves through the eyes of the sane, enforcing this relentless, inescapable, internalized self-awareness. The prison walls were no longer made of stone, you see. They were built entirely out of guilt.
Which leaves us with this final haunting question to ponder today. Did the modern asylum truly liberate the madmen, as our history books confidently claim? Or did it simply change the nature of their chains, making them invisible, psychological, and therefore incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to break? Foucault's brilliant mapping of the Citadel forces us to completely rethink the foundations of modern institutional power, and it really makes you wonder how we, even today, draw that invisible line between reason and unreason. Think about that for a while.